Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our weekly orthopedic surgery grand rounds. Today, we have the honor of visiting speaker from Johns Hopkins. And for an introduction, I'll turn it over to Dr. Feely.
Thank you for introducing me. All right. So I know this is going to be a great talk because Dr. Iyer brought his Celsius that is unopened yet. He brought his parents. And we heard that Dr. Iyer's dad is willing to ask questions throughout the talk. Dr. Iyer is chief of foot and ankle from Johns Hopkins, but more importantly, or equally importantly, depending on what you think of feet, he is ortho mentor, and he has built part of his career on providing important mentorship advice for fellows, residents, and medical students. And part of the reason why I wanted to have him come out is we did an instructional course lecture last year at the Academy. And as we gave the talk, it was me, a bunch of famous older people, and tabs. And by the end, when we finished, there was a large flock of people of all ages who came and wanted to speak to him. And I realized how important and influential his circle of influence had become. And I realized it would be great if he could come out and impart some of the knowledge that he has on mentorship and leadership within orthopedic surgery. He's developed in his relatively young career, where he started in Miami and is now at Johns Hopkins, a really influential sphere. He is one of the associate chief editors at JAOS. Like I said, he's chief of foot and ankle at Johns Hopkins, and he has had a variety of different leadership and education awards. So I'm going to turn it over to him so he has the full time to talk, and his parents have time to ask questions at the end.
First off, thank you so kindly for that introduction and for the invitation. I couldn't be more honored. And I would probably say I think Brian's probably lying about 3/4 of that. So it really is. I'm not sure who he's talking about specifically, but I'm humbled to be here regardless. I'm going to assume that this helps to click slides. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Okay, so you can't walk around like I normally do. That's okay. So I'm going to set a timer because, as my wife, who would yell at me otherwise, it's like, don't talk too long. And if I have an hour, I could probably easily add another 30 minutes to that. So I'll keep it simple. So in fact, my parents could ask questions at some point in time. Here are my disclosures. And I suppose that one of the important ones is the fact that I do this thing kind of on the side known as Ortho Mentor that may be familiar to some of you. I remember early in my career staring at attendings when they had these disclosure lists. And now I'm like, man, I have to update these disclosure lists every few minutes. And so it's, but more importantly, it's to thank all of you for being here, to Dr. Ma and the entire team. Really, I appreciate this. One of my, medical students back on the East Coast helped me put some of these slides together. So really, a debt of gratitude to all of you. I do want to give a special shout out to Dr. Feely, in part for inviting me to be a part of that instructional course lecture with some legends in orthopedics, to be up on that stage. And this is a photo of all of us back from March. I'd be remiss not to feel very awestruck, being around that group of individuals and to hear their perspective, and to be able to inject a little bit of mine from the time that I've been in practice, which interestingly is now in my 10th year, or starting my 10th year as OPER. So to give you a quick intro, I'm actually from California originally, and I grew up in the town of Fremont, where I know one of the hospitals is contracted for trauma. I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley, so down the way I went to Drexel. We called it UC Drexel because so many California kids went there. I did my residency at Penn State out in Hershey. I did my fellowship at Mercy in Baltimore. And, and of course, Dr. Gendelberg, who some of you know, was my co-resident. And so I'm not going to put too many embarrassing photos of him in here. I've been very discreet about which ones I've put in, but last night after he and I were hanging out, I thought I would shift things around. So we'll see what's actually in there now. For the first 6 years of my practice, I was in this place. I actually lived literally right there. It was called the Icon Building. Now it's like the W Hotel. And it was in the heart of Miami. And everyone asked me all the time, why on earth would you leave Miami, Florida? And it was great. It was sort of, I remember my mom and I getting into this sort of argumentative dialogue, and we were both screaming about the same thing, that I needed to be in warmer weather. I had trained, I'd gone to med school in Philadelphia. I'd been in Hershey. I needed to get away from the snow. And so then after being in Miami, I decided to leave. And as much as Brian might not be a fan of mine, for this reason, I became a Baltimore Ravens fan. I apologize to anyone who's not in the audience, or as a Steelers fan for that matter. But we had our daughter. This is a picture of us when we first moved back, interestingly enough, and she's now about to be 4 years old. And then subsequently, I didn't have, but we had our second, Keshav, and this is actually a photo of us, my wife and the two kiddos and I, at my parents' house in Fremont, California. So this is just from a couple of years ago. And yeah, my son now has more hair than I do, which is kind of wild. The reason this piece of mentorship, or this element of mentorship, has become so important to me is probably very much driven by something I didn't appreciate for a very long time. And that's why I give special thanks to my family and my mom and dad who are sitting here. I didn't know if they would actually come today because it's very early. My dad's usually up at 4 a.m., posting on LinkedIn, but my mom is not. So I think that, but I am not who I am now without them. And I think the concept of mentorship is so generational in nature, right? And historically, we learn from grandparents, we learn from parents, we learn from, cousins, siblings. That is in part where the familia element has really driven for me and has become that much more clear as now in my own sort of parental role, why mentorship is really a critical thing. And so I give them really I owe them a debt of gratitude for being here, not just this early, but also because of, what sort of values they instilled in me that I'm able to now bring to the table. So people ask me all the time, why did I pick foot and ankle, right? Why not joints or anything else for that matter? And interestingly enough, I grew up breakdancing, and some folks know that, including Dr. Gendelberg. But I figured it was also a younger field as a whole. There was a lot of room for innovation and research. And I actually trained, interestingly enough, as an Indian classical dancer. So I did that for a number of years, kind of an art, it's called Bharatanatyam, sort of analogous to ballet. And it just, for all the injuries I sustained between also, breakdancing and, losing and attempting to win and random dance battles over the years, all those ankle sprains really made it easier for me to understand, appreciate what my patients were going through, and also from just a pathology perspective, what I was dealing with. And that's something that, just clicked. Out of every other field, that was the one that clicked, interestingly enough. And so, so that's what made sense to me. And it was sort of like a late decision. That too was probably in around my third year. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to those attendings that inspired me, the ones that Dr. G and I trained with, once upon a time. So let's take a step back. Let's go back to, 2013. And obviously I was a chief. David was probably putting a cast on the wrong person, getting casted himself, as opposed to whoever we had asked him to go reduce at the time. So he was in the throes of the hospital. And this is a photo, literally. So this photo is, this is actually, we all decide as chiefs, we decide to take call together. So we cover the entire hospital. And we thought it would be like amazing. We thought it would be just this wonderful thing of like, we were going to get hammered. The pager was going to get hammered. We were going to like be able to handle everything and all that. But we had like one consult, one operative case. It was like 4 of us around this like one super condoler. We're like, hey, what do we do now? That was actually the one case that we're in with our peds attendant. And so then you fast forward to literally that graduation. And I wanted to get a haircut, could not fit it in because of other stuff that I was on I was trauma chief at the time. And ironically, and this is the other reason I wanted my parents to come here, because the very reason why Dr. Feely was, asking or bringing up the question piece, the last time my 2 parents were together watching me talk was when I was giving my residency research presentation. And my dad and my brother both decided to start pimping me at the very end of my talk. And that is something, that's amazing. I mean, you got to have a lot of gravitas to be able to do that. But for one, I was like, why would you ask me these questions now? But I thought to 11 years later, here we are. And to be able to have them, see what I do on sort of a more regular basis now, it's just, astounding. But the thing that I want to kind of bring up about that particular year is that my last, and I think we've all been there, whatever service it is, that last particular block of my chief year, I was on joints and I was struggling big time. And I remember I had asked one day of the attending, like a particular attending, I said, hey, I know I'm struggling. what can I do to improve? You know, I had learned Pendleton's rules about feedback and ascertaining that. And I remember, I will never forget this, it's singed into my brain. I don't know how to help you, was literally what that person said to me. And I was just floored. And I said, and it still kind of gives me the chills even right now. It's been like 11 years at this point. But the reason why it's so burned in my brain, I said, you're here in academia, supposed to be teaching, supposed to be like nurturing, empowering, really inspiring people to like learn. And irrespective of that, I wasn't going into joints, but I was like, this is an opportunity for you as an educator to really mentor, guide, coach, advise, whatever you want to call it at that moment. And he failed. And that to me was a hands out. So he failed in the sense of providing me the sort of empowerment I wanted and needed at that time, the constructive feedback. I would have been receptive to that. But instead, he succeeded because it catalyzed in me something that I knew that I was then going to change moving forward. So I learned that the type of mentor I did not want to be, for one. That was an important thing, that no one should be made to feel stupid, right? That was just not my priority. And really that I needed to innovate the way in which mentorship, advising, coaching, whatever you want to call it, is carried out. And so I knew sort of this was now sort of the tail end of my time in residency. I knew that, okay, this was just a stepping stone towards something much, much different, much, much bigger, much, much better that I was going to try to improve upon. And so that is in part, let's like go back to basics. And, you know, what is mentorship? And mentorship, you know, depending on how you define or what you look at, is really this exchange of information, right? Usually from someone who's more senior to someone who's more junior, along the context of sort of like educational spectrum, right? I'm interested in this. I want to learn more about this. And so there's this dialogue that happens, and that it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that evolves over time, that's organic in nature, and really relies on sort of a bi-directional flow of information. So if you Google, you see how many results pop up, right? Because so many people want mentorship, you know, whether they really speak to that, like I do, or whether some people just think about it and then are, you know, Googling it on the phone or asking ChatGPT in this day and age. And no, I forgot to ask ChatGPT what mentorship was before this talk, which was silly. If you think about the actual, you know, kind of the definition by Google of that too, which to my dad's point, it's from Oxford. So there you go. It's the guidance provided by someone who's usually in a more senior role to someone who's more junior, who has aspirations in the same career, typically, right? And so we think of it in sort of very within the same discipline more often than not. That's not always the case, right? You can have a mentor in a different field altogether, different specialty. And so it doesn't have to be isolated to just the thing that you're interested in. But as, you know, the illustrious Oprah Winfrey says, we're all mentors, even if we don't realize it, right? You're giving guidance to your, you know, to your kids. You're giving guidance to, you know, people around you, loved ones, friends. You're receiving guidance about a challenging situation at home with the family. All of that represents some along the arc of mentorship, even though it may not be mentorship in its like finite or discrete form as we think about it, is definitely something that's along that spectrum. And so what does it mean to you? And I'll ask Dr. Schroeder, because I see her right there, and I've known Dr. Schroeder for a long time now. And so what does mentorship mean to you, Dr. Schroeder, if I had to put you on the spot?
It's working. Yeah. To me, I think it's important to be able to have somebody that can answer the tough questions that you have about your career, about the pathway and the trajectory that you're taking, advice related to it. So not just necessarily about like, I want to do orthopedics and I want to do hand. It's kind of, you know, for me, it was important to find people who had mentors about life and work-life balance for me, understanding that I had a partner who traveled a lot for work. So that was all really important. So aspects of, you know, there are different mentors who can answer various parts of your life, but finding those and people that can give you advice that's both true, honest, and can be tough at times, I think is really critical to finding a good mentor.
That's a great answer. And I think that mentorship sort of varies, right? It's sort of how you interpret it. It's not like a strict definition, but there definitely is how people interpret it, whether it's on a faculty level or whether it's on a more learner level, can vary. And it varies and it's influenced by learning styles, just cultural nuances, where people are at and station of life that they're in. So the mentorship is important. So this was a survey of the general populace that was published in Harvard Business Review a handful of years ago. And they talked about how, so when they surveyed people across a variety of disciplines, not just healthcare, the majority of people, over 50% or higher, basically, or close to that, said that it was important in some capacity, or even very important, as you can see here. And so majority of people did not have a mentor. And interestingly enough, if you Google again, the need for finding one becomes that much more palpable, right? Because, and we'll get into in a second, but what is the long-term effects of having a mentor? And, interestingly enough, we take that same survey and divide it up in terms of where there are mentors. And ironically, the lowest amount is in healthcare. Various industries in business, they have formal mentorship programs. It's a very part of how people get from one position in a company to a more senior position in said same company. It's having that sort of like arc. And some residency programs obviously have formal mentorship programs, some have informal ones. But just in general, in healthcare, it's a little bit more sparse, if you will. And the main thing that you have to think about is that these relationships, like I said earlier, it's not just about it develops overnight. It is a longitudinal play. There is this bi-directional flow of information. So I'm learning from those I mentor just as much as those mentees are learning from me. And I would hope with every person that I consider a mentee of mine, I am learning something from that. Because to me, it's sort of that exchange of information, not just, hey, I'm like going to give you all this and I know everything and that's it. And in my humble opinion, that's not really how it should be. And I think this becomes even more important when we think about in our own lives, right? How can doctors be, better mentors? And so it's an availability. Our schedules are so tight, right? I mean, like I'm seeing anywhere between 35 and 50 patients in a given day. And then all the administrative stuff of that, right? Where do I build in the time to connect with students who, I was talking to one yesterday, first year medical student. This morning, I already got a message about a pre-med student who wants to come shadow. So these kinds of things, so you've got to figure out what is your role in all of that, right? Are you just someone who directs to another person? Are you someone who's going to be more proactively involved? Where do you sort of fit in? Can you be objective about the goals that you want to set for a said relationship if you want something that's more formal? And you also need to be mindful. Ironically, this has come up more recently with some of the vernacular that's out on TikTok. But the reality is, and I was going to switch it, but I decided not to. But the reality is that you have to consider the vantage point of someone else around you, right? That is really very important, as you navigate through this. This was an article that came out of academic medicine from several centers, but predominantly Cornell, and they speak to the value of mentorship, research productivity, academic promotion, career satisfaction, faculty retention, ability to generate the next generation of leaders. And what's even more interesting, in the same article, the strategic use of social media and other digital technologies to push this forward, right? So we don't all have the time. Like my academic time is supposed to be every Wednesday. I now have like 0 to no academic time because I basically fill it up with add-on patients or with OR. So I can't tell students, and separately, the medical school, as an example, is on one campus and I am literally never ever there. So where do you find the time to really how can you connect? And especially without taking advantage of technology. And so this article sort of speaks to that. And we guide our patients all the time, right? That's the kicker here. Like every time I step into that room, I'm giving a patient advice. I am mentoring them about the prognosis of what they're dealing with, right? What's the conservative approach? What's the operative approach? Which may be more optimal for them given their lifestyle. And we educate them on all these different treatment strategies. We empower our patients as best as we can to take accountability for their own healthcare. I mean, I literally have recently a 19-year-old patient who has a BMI of 72. And the conversation about, they've had surgery with someone else, they've gone on to a non-union. I have to speak about the fact that one of the major reasons why they probably didn't heal is the weight element. And how do you delicately, handle that? So I bring that up because that is, so if I have a student who again comes to me has not a competitive application, how do I delicately speak to them about, maybe you ought to consider another career? How do I, really sort of get them to understand that they can still be a physician, still be involved in musculoskeletal care, but orthopedics, as an example, may not be optimal for them? How do you have those tough conversations? And that's important, right? So we have to, regardless, inspire these patients to improve their quality of life. And that, I think, is how do we learn from our own prior, like a surgery you did yesterday, and oh man, I wish this could have been better. I wish I should have been more efficient about that. All those mental notes that we take, that we encourage residents to make, keep those notes about what you would take away from a given case. Those are things that, I personally do. I don't do it on a piece of paper or computer anymore, but it's in my brain every single time. I did this in this case. And shout out to my brother who just rolled into the building too. A total family affair, right? Disappointed my wife's not here. So, but I think that that's an important adjunct to this, right? Is considering that we do this regularly, whether we realize it formally or not. And so this is, again, back to that article, and we've got to really be mindful about that, how similar these two elements are. Mentoring and doctoring are very similar. The kicker with this is specifically that with doctoring, obviously, we are many times incentivized, right? There's a value proposition to taking care of our patients. However, with mentoring the next generation, you may not feel that way. And if you feel that your time, your bandwidth, both fiscally, mentally, physically, is spent, you may not feel that this is as important. And that's okay. That's a decision you have to make. But I will tell you that for some of these reasons we've been talking about, in the same way we invest time into our patients, and we know that there's shortages, and we'll go over that in a little bit, of physicians in the future, especially in subspecialties. It's critical that we mentor the next generation, whether they go into orthopedics, obviously what I'm biased towards, as most of us are, or anything else for that matter. So these workforce considerations become that much more important because, as we know, there are shortages expected by like the mid 2020s. So obviously we're about to be there, and even to the early 2030s about the shortages. And then naturally on the arthroplasty side, as many articles I've spoken to, the need for arthroplasty surgeons. And as much as, one of my, I still remember when Jay Parvizi, my mentor for all those years ago. Yeah, that would be weird. Mentor for all those years ago, right? When I didn't match the first time, when I told him that I wasn't doing joints, he was coming to grand rounds back at Hershey, he was like, stop the car. And he was like, what are you doing with your life? I said, I'm going to do foot and ankle. He says, you never told me this. I was like, yeah, I felt really bad about telling you I was going to do something totally different. And then he asked me, so what made you do this? And I said, toe money, toe problems. And so all that to say, you have to figure out where your people are, right? But this speaks to, hey, how important it is that we develop this next generation to fill in these voids on a workforce perspective, because that obviously affects the aging population as a whole. And the thing is, there's more and more articles about, as we do this, as the population, and we know the census is going to diversify. It is very important for our patients that we diversify, across the board, right? And you cannot, unless you're proactively not just being inclusive, but also sponsoring folks to, rise in sort of an organization, right? Whether it be in healthcare or otherwise, you will not be able to actually, David's taking a picture of Dr. Satsky, who was the trauma fellow when we were finishing residency. And so the reality is that that's a very important thing. You've got to diversify, but that only occurs as a result of inclusivity at the same time. So you've got to be able to so a lot of people speak to, hey, we want to increase our complement in residents, right? And DEI type efforts. But are you able to, on the whole, how is the faculty representation, right? How is the organizational representation in that regard? So this is particularly important as we think about how we guide and mentor the next generation. And it is critical that it happens. I mean, medical school is great, obviously. That's when people are making the decision to proceed into orthopedics, right? But the reality is, and sometimes people decide or they're very heavily influenced before, but the kicker is that it's even upstream of that. If there's opportunities like these pre-med students that reach out to me, I remember as a Berkeley student reaching out to folks at UCSF and not hearing anything, not in ortho. I was going to do pediatric oncology at the time. But the reality is that you have to be willing to sort of see that, hey, these are folks who are potentially colleagues 10, 15 years down the line, and they all, should get some form of investment, as it were, because this is how we bring people and retain folks over time. And so this is the mentor and availability of that may be one of the most critical elements of success, whether it be in orthopedics, as this article speaks to, or otherwise. And I think that cannot be understated. And so when we looked at sort of how this, when Liz Matskin from one of the Harvard hospitals looked at this, there really isn't, like, majority of people did not have a mentor in medical school. Many did, but many didn't, interestingly enough. And so there is still this lack of availability, and many times it's driven by, as we talked about, time. The overarching currency is time, right? The learners have constraints, the faculty have constraints. Everyone's limited. So what little time you have, right? So as my two little ones are, as they call me Uppa at home, and they've kind of modified it to be Buppy, as they're screaming Buppy, 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 Buppy. And then I have students on the phone listening to this, right? I have to figure out, how do I make sure I'm prioritizing being present with my kids, who are the ultimate ortho mentees, whereas at the same time, the actual students themselves who want to be able to be guided by someone who can be present for them as well. So I think that's an important kind of add to all of this. And I think when you're thinking about how to develop these relationships, right? And I was just talking to a student about this yesterday. I'm not super formal about it, but I think, at least from this article, defining goals can be very beneficial. Defining what the ideal mentor looks like for you. Look all around you, right? Peers can be mentors as well. Set up those initial conversations. You won't know until you email somebody. Especially in this day and age. I don't think a Snapchat will get you very far, but you have to also identify who is the right kind of person for you to connect with, right? Just because you hear back from someone, and if you don't have that good rapport with them, that may not be the ideal person for you. So finding and being okay with that, being willing and able to talk to somebody else, becomes that much more important. So how do we instill this importance of mentorship in today's world, right? When we're constantly swiping and doing stuff. And this is where the digital aspect of things really comes into play. And so these are my personal pillars of mentorship. And, whether it's accessibility, interactivity, informality, availability, longevity, right? I get constantly asked, like, oh my God, you must have thousands and thousands of mentees. And I'm like, absolutely not. There's no way I'm mentoring every single person. I was like that, or I have people reach out to me, can you be my mentor? And I'm like, no, and I say, I'm not saying no because I'm not willing to interact with you, but mentorship is a very longitudinally developed, organically developing relationship. And so if someone just says, can you be my mentor? I was like, that's not the right question. The right question is, can I come spend time with you in the clinic, in the OR, and let that be the stepping stone to identify, hey, do you like staring at feet all day long, like what I obviously do? Or do you like, seeing this type of pathology? Do you like researching these topics? If it's not of interest to you, then us having an ongoing relationship just for kicks is not really ideal. So that's where you have to sort of figure out, or students and the faculty, learners in general, have to figure out who are they going to mesh with. And I think that's a really important thing. So that's where, in part, all of this kind of comes into play. So I advise a lot of people, as Dr. Feely said so kindly earlier, but I probably mentor a way smaller percentage of that, because of, again, I think about people who I've had this longitudinal relationship with. That's two-way. It's not just me reaching out to them, it's them reaching out to me over time as well. So of course, we've all seen this particular meme. And as I've had to deal with this exact case myself at some point in time, what have I observed in orthopedics? And why did I start to think about with students? There was definitely at the time, so going back a handful of years now, probably 10 years or so, at the early part of my practice in Miami, there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? What happens here at UCSF, you have wonderful faculty here, wonderful people who are willing to be connected to, the residents and the students. That's not the same case everywhere. Right? At some places, like when I was at Miami, you would not get a response. I still remember there was a resident who had matched, and he was then, I think, a PGY4. We were at our ortho interest group meeting. He was talking about his experience as a Miami med student. And he had emailed one of the associate program directors when he was a med student. By the time he was a 4, he had still not gotten a response from said associate program director, for which he was now a part of the residency. So it goes back to this notion of, it's not a priority for everyone. And that's okay. But the reality is learners are hungry for connection. And unfortunately, there's this sort of, it's very, it's not homogenous, it's not uniform. And the accessibility piece comes into play big time as well. Historically, right, there's been limited online resources, right? Everyone's looking at, everyone's looking at online now for a variety of things. The learning styles have changed amongst students, amongst residents, how they retain information and learn information, and also how they connect. That's also become very different too. And so there has always been sort of in my mind, going back to me being told, I don't know how to help you, a lack of modernization of it. And so why did I start focusing on students? Because at least at Miami, at the time when I started thinking about all this stuff, there was a very palpable deficiency in advising and mentorship. There were varying degrees of department engagement, like literally students didn't know where to turn to, at least in Florida. And I wanted to also instill this sense of like a new age mentorship and leadership. And so what I did at Miami and now at and now Hopkins is, I became close with the deans. I'm way closer with the deans at Miami than I am at Hopkins. They're a little bit different kind of story. I engage with the residents and faculty of my department, and with the student interest group, which pretty much through which I run everything, interact with the students through that. And that was what really led to sort of, these ongoing conversations where I was able to see with some of our studies we did, like, hey, match rates were slightly higher with, ortho interest group involvement. And so, of course, it's always like, what's your primary outcome, right? For students, it's like, hey, especially with how, crazy things have gotten, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to be able to, match, like, what do I need to do that, right? That anxiety surrounding all of that. And so that was in part why I decided to work through the interest group. And so we paired residents, faculty with students. There were shadowing opportunities, research. I had one-on-one meetings. There was the Starbucks that was right at the library in Miami, so we would just meet there half the time. And then because while I have my Celsius now, I'm obsessed with Starbucks. I just didn't have time to get one before we came out. So I always, with every student that reaches out, I genuinely will connect with them. Every student, every single student. I may have talked to some of you in here. I actually recognize some of the names of some of the residents who have matched. And the reality is that to me is important, right? Because even if others can't find a way, don't have time, which I get and appreciate tremendously, I said, someone's got to do it, because I don't ever want anyone to go through what I went through when I was going through this process. And I've also had some really great mentors over the years. And that have been critical in my development as a surgeon, that I would be remiss to not give back myself. And again, that's my own sort of priority for internally. And so as part of this, all these relationships sort of continue theoretically through the course of the fourth year, where we're, reviewing applications, and people are in the thick of it now, obviously with ERAS having just been submitted, and application reviews going through. And so as part of sort of linking everyone together, we do this thing called Bones and Brews. And I know it's not the spine and wine that I heard about last night, but it's an event that I personally sponsor to allow students and residents and faculty members who are available to informally connect, talk ortho, talk about life, talk about what it's like to actually be in this field, and kind of go from there in terms of developing those relationships a little bit more organically, right? Without it being in sort of a more structured format. So I think that becomes important too in terms of breaking down some of those barriers or hierarchical barriers. So there's, the way we do the advising for fourth years. We have a spring meeting for all fourth years. In the summer, we do one-on-one meetings. In the fall, we, advocate, myself and the program director, Dr. Don Laporte, to 3 programs per student, to kind of weight the signal, which some of you may be familiar with. And then we send emails to the number 1 for each student at the end. And this, I think the key things with regards to the students specifically is that being honest, right? The students in general, and y'all can tell me if I'm totally wrong, students want honest, transparent feedback. That has been my sense doing this over the years now. And however, they want to know, it's not just like, okay, like, you suck, like that won't get you very far. But how can you suck less? What is going to improve your ability to actually improve for the next time around? So that is where it's on me, in part, to distill the feedback I heard from attendings and residents on one sub-I, give that feedback in a way that's understandable and individualized for someone who maybe there's cultural barriers, maybe there's language barriers, maybe there's, hey, like they've not thought about it, maybe no one's talked to them about it before. Those are important things, right? And that is critical, especially during their fourth year, about like, hey, how things have gone. And that's where I really try to make myself available anytime this. In fact, I've already been getting messages right now that are popping up on my phone from students, interestingly enough. So through all of this, it became clear that there was sort of a modernizing paradigm shift of mentorship that needed to occur. And that was what led to the kind of development of the Ortho Mentor platform. And, for those of you who know, it kind of encompasses, several things. And social media outreach was like part of that. We, did these Insta Live series with program directors. I was able to convince Bill Levine, when he was editor, to come up with a whole brand new section in a blog. I'm not sure why he was listening to me at the time, but he still sticks by it to this day. And this was designed to give people insight into what is it like, being on the other side. What is it like as a young faculty member? What is it like as a resident? What are tips and tricks for dealing with the match process? And then, of course, the webinars that we've done over the years, some of which have, garnered 3,000 people, as a whole. So it's been, pretty good. And, Dr. Schroeder's been, on a few of them, has been so kind to lend her advice to that. And, that all has culminated in, in this. And the sound may be a little bit off here, but if you listen closely, this is my daughter Mira. She was 3 and some change, or just barely turned 3.
It's an X-ray. That's not an X-ray. Yes. It's not an X-ray. That's what? Yeah. Bones. That's the bones. Looking for an X-ray?
She keeps going to the spine, for the record, which I find ironic. So how do we make mentorship more accessible, be more inclusive as a whole? And I think that, I am very honored to have been sort of at the forefront of sort of doing this from a digital perspective anyway. Other platforms have developed, including the Medical Student Orthopedic Society, which has been a great resource for a lot of students. But I will tell you, the things that I have learned is that models of mentorship have the ability to change, propensity to change, especially, or evolve in the digital age. We need longitudinal advising mentorship. It's critical. It's critical to our success, right? We all impart, whether we realize it or not, we are getting to where we're these different phases, different stations of training, learning, whatever, because of people who have given us guidance, ahead of us, and allowed us to navigate the terrain. And that's where it's, and navigate pitfalls, right? And what to avoid. And I will tell you that it is critical, as I've said a few times already, to invest efforts to groom the next generation. And I think a proactive approach is really important. And you have to be honest. I think that that's a really important thing, that if someone's struggling at whatever the level, if you can't have an honest conversation about sort of like how to help that person get through this mountain that ought to be climbed, then that is I think then we're unfortunately doing a disservice to that person and their ability to succeed. Mentor, sponsor those around you, and I always like to say, don't wait to be invited to the party, Photoshop your own invitation. You could probably ask ChatGPT to do it for you now. So there you go. And things don't happen overnight, but persistent patience is key. And, I will tell you that the bottom line really is that mentorship is critical to our personal and professional success in life. And for the fourth years or in the audience, it's probably been more relevant because of the orthopedic match, right? Which is obviously at the forefront of many people's minds. And so, as I transition to this sort of last stage, of the talk here, I didn't match the first time. And I think that that's something I'm very honest with people about how difficult it can be, how anxiety provoking. I still remember calling my dad and my mom about not matching. I remember being outside of Drexel's, like when I did match, and just and I was crying on the phone. And my dad was like, "Oh, so you didn't match?" It was like, "It didn't work out this time." I said, "No, I matched. This was the second time around." He says, "Oh," he says, "You gave me a heart attack because you were crying. So I didn't know if it was happy tears, sad tears, what was going on." And I've given him my brother and I have given him plenty of palpitations over the years, but that's a different story for a different day. So when we think about the how competitive it's gotten, right? And just going back to even the more recent, data, the match rate last year, so 2023, was 60 something percent. It was about that, maybe a little bit lower this current year. Number of applications have gone up. And if you look at the 2024 sort of snapshot, one position was unfilled in the entire country, right? And it probably went to somebody who was already preordained for that, if I had to venture a guess. It's very rare that a spot goes unfilled that isn't sort of behind under the table being given to someone else. So again, maybe it wasn't, but that's usually the case. So you can just see the numbers are staggering. And what's even, and while this does not account for something called signaling, which we'll get into in a minute, you needed those who matched, had about, and this is on MD senior specifically, but it was around 12. You had to rank 12 to match roughly. And most people were just matching or just ranking orthopedic surgery, as it were. The step 2 score, so step 1, we don't worry about as much anymore, but for those who have it, it's obviously 254 or 244, but step 2 has become increasingly important. So, right, it's great, right? Amazing. I'm not even sure, my score was nowhere near that when I applied. And the things that people are doing now, I program this to serve as this water filtration system on the other side of the world. I use a robot to develop it. I'm like, who are you? I'm like, I don't understand how I would fare compared to some of these folks that are coming through. And so it's becoming harder and harder is what it is. And so there's a lot of anxiety that develops as a result of this. And so the away rotation was the most important thing, very critical to, and that's what's been historically, demonstrated, step 1 in the past, the number of ranks, AOA status. But now AOA is kind of going, a little bit, I don't want to say totally by the wayside, but many schools are pulling out of it or are basically saying there's some degree of bias associated with it. So it may not be as important. Many schools post-COVID all went to pass fail, right? Hopkins, we did that. So now at Miami, they have this kind of quartile system, which is still confusing to me to this day. But the reality is that things have changed. So a lot of this stuff has gone by the wayside because in part of, adaptations during COVID. And so during that time, your ability to digitally interact, right? So I'll pause there and say, I still remember when I still remember being at home, actually here in California, when the American Orthopaedic Association was basically giving, in part, indirectly, giving me grief about OrthoMentor because it was basically, in some way, they were trying to say it was inappropriate. I was using social media to do what I was doing. And now fast forward that, and I had heard this from a couple of different people from behind closed doors. I was like, that's interesting. My brother, who's big time into communications and policy, said to me, listen, all press is good press. And I said, okay, that's fair. I'm like, I'm still thinking about my career down the line, how that's going to affect things, but okay, well, we'll roll with that. And then pandemic hits and everyone is on social media, right? And it was a way, because there were no away rotations. You had to be able to get your name out there, program strengths out there. You had to be able to interact with students, and all that went up. And so while people matched at their home institution predominantly, because it was like, okay, hey, we know you. Like at Hopkins, we didn't match a single home person that year, interestingly enough. So I think there was definitely some sort of spread between how they sort of valued the home students versus not. During that time, and this was a paper that came out in 2020, and the kicker is that over nearly 70% of programs had a Instagram account that was formed during that point in time. And that had the largest sort of traction, 620% growth, which was interesting. And so, the idea of that, a applicant's opinion was sort of impacted by what programs were posting about, we definitely saw that. And really the appearance of what the social interaction was like amongst the residents themselves became really critical, right? When they were sort of thinking about rank lists. Are the residents happy? Right? I mean, I always tell people, you go to these social events, more so it's not even about the social event itself. It's about looking to see what is the interaction, the chemistry like between the residents, and specifically between the residents and the faculty. Right? Those are key things that are not always very palpable or visible when you're doing a away rotation. right? You might see that faculty spread out different hospitals. But in the social environment, you might get a keener sense of that. So this, clearly spoke to that in terms of social media perspective. These were some more papers that came out speaking about sort of the value proposition about learning about programs. There's a JBJS critical issues paper. And this was another cross-sectional study looking at there was a correlation between the amount of posts and their higher doximity ranking, interestingly enough. And if you look at, doximity ranking in part looks at a variety of things, but it is not the end all be all in terms of, how strong a program is, just for the students in the audience in particular. So what was the virtual experience like, right? Many people had very formal virtual away experiences or virtual learning opportunities. Obviously, a lot more cost effective. You also you could do it from wherever you were, and for the students, save them money, right? You didn't have to find like a random apartment to crash in, off of Airbnb or Craigslist or whatever y'all are using these days, VRBO. And I still remember Craigslist, and I was like, that was very creepy at the time. So PDs were certainly limited in terms of their ability, PD and PD teams, to how does someone just jive with the program? Just because you do well at one place does not mean you will do well at another place, right? There's this fit factor that comes into play. And it also, there's the social aspect of it, right? I'm not talking about, oh, hey, like, are you going to go and like hang out with all the residents, like at whatever, like bar club or otherwise? I'm talking about this sort of social emotion of the EQ, the emotional intelligence about recognizing how do you sort of dovetail with the team? How do you recognize sort of like, are you the person who, when we're really at a critical part of the case, you're going to ask a zillion questions and not be able to appreciate sort of we're at a critical part of the case, and right now is probably not the best time to ask questions? Some people are very adept at that, and some people are not. It is harder to recognize that in a virtual environment than in person, as an example. And so obviously, there are many specialties that still stick with the virtual interviewing. Some of the primary care specialties are still doing that. It's very cost effective for them. They also probably have voluminously way more people that they have to bring through. So that plays, a major role as well. However, when we did it, Opto had interview caps. It was like max you could do is 20. Ortho did not. So you would have some people at that time who would have 25, 30 interview invites, hoard them. And then you'd have people who were perfectly just as qualified, but on wait list, waiting for someone to release them. But again, people were freaking out, and not surprising. I mean, you look at this data and it's very striking, to say the least. On average, we found that people were more likely to match at their med school affiliate institution than compared to prior years, probably because of the fact that you had people you knew. That was an important thing to consider too. And when we did the survey study, kind of way back when, at this point, this notion of advocacy started coming back around, right? So once upon a time, you'd make a phone call, like, my chair would call Dr. Ma and say, hey, like, and say, oh yeah, this person's great, we'll take it, done, right? Used to be like that once upon a time. The match process can change that up. Phone calls became important to a degree, but probably not the same degree. Now it's like, well, like if Dr. Ma calls me about a student, then it's like, well, hey, am I going to trust what Tab says about this? Hopefully he would. But the reality is that now it comes back to letters of recommendation are as great as they are. Many of times they're very great for everybody. So you need to read between the lines. And that's where some of this sort of internal communication becomes important to help support the process, figuring out who's best for your program. Majority of the program directors found that hybrid interviews would actually disadvantage applicants who chose virtual options. So when there was some discussion about, hey, trying to mix, and at Hopkins, I had suggested that, and we were told very irately, no, that's not going to happen. But now we've been fully in person for the last couple of years. I know in the UC systems have been a little bit different. Nikki, it's changed, right? Like all the UCs were unable to participate in in-person interviews, right? And has that changed like for this cycle, or is it changing for the cycle? Got it. I heard that too. Okay. So, so of course, this is the, electronic, residency application 2020, they started, putting into the supplemental application. And so what comes up now? And so enter signaling. And so signaling is this concept that you're in the same way. So if I, reach out to Dr. Lance and I say, Drew, I got this guy or gal who's amazing. Right? That is a signal in some way. Right? That conversation, whether it's, we're texting him or emailing him, whatever. But there's never been a formal way for students to advocate for themselves. And that is what the signal represents. And it was initially, ENT was the first to do it, but what they were finding is that they only had like 4 or something like that. And everyone was signaling the same places. So it really wasn't very helpful. So the American Orthopaedic Association, so now it's in its 3rd cycle. And the idea was, how do you make it more equitable? How do you make it more reproducible? How do you also at the same time limit the thousands upon thousands of apps that are coming into Dr. Kim's inbox? And they're saying, hey, here's 1,500 applications. You've got to go through every single one of them. And that's a daunting task because it's a lot. There's a lot of great people. Everyone's amazing. So how do you kind of limit that in some way? And how do you really get a keen sense from a student that you really want to be here versus I'm just going to apply to, all 185 or 200 programs that are around. And so the signaling element was designed to sort of help break down barriers on both sides and really support the learners as well as the faculty. And so we have the most. And the idea behind that was to impart, and I think some of the other specialties are going towards that. OBGYN now has it, but they also have like weighted ones, like I think like gold, silver, platinum or something of that nature, or gold, silver, bronze. I don't know. But the idea behind, but these signals are binary, right? They're meaning that it's 0 or yes or no. There's no way to weight. I want to weight my number 1 signal, like for my number 1 program, the spot number 1. And there's no way to do that, right? Not technically. And so, but I'll get into that in just a second. And so when we think about the sort of signaling sphere, an article that we published about 2 years ago now, this is now sort of the initial screen, right? So a lot of places are using this signal like, hey, did you signal us or did you not? And so when students are asking me, like, how do we actually, like I'm going to apply to 75 programs, right? And I say, why? Like, because I'm going to just throw my hat into the ring for more than 30 plus more, just to see what happens. I'm like, cool. Okay, that's great. Good for you. Like, you want to just put money into the mix. Like, you don't have Amazon or Netflix to have to pay for, or something else you want to spend money on, a trip in the summer after you match conceivably. But the reality is what we're finding with the data that, we have published as well, is that the preference signaling program is designed to cut down the number of applications coming through, which it has. And we've seen dramatic decreases over the last 3 years, but also to, and limit that over application phenomenon, improve and optimize diversity efforts. And I think that some of these most important factors are away rotation performance coupled to the signal. So that becomes an important thing. What is a way to weight it? You spend time at a place you have signaled, right? Conceivably. And that was why the AOA has basically said, if you did an away at UCSF, you should signal them, right? If you're a home student, if you're an away student, doesn't matter. You should signal them, right? Because that is a way to effectively weight, right? Conceivably, your signal to them. Oh, I did a year off. I did research here, right? Wherever, Hopkins. Okay, that's weighting your signal, right? So there is a way to add some gravity to it, but that's sort of informal, if you will. And as the data is now showing, you couple this to step 2, that's what becomes important in terms of the final match, as it were. And applicants who signaled a place were nearly 27 times more likely to actually receive an interview than those who did not. And this is a more recent survey that just came out. So, I think that we think about, I would always say, hey, if you had a strong application, you're in a top tier, 30 to 50, your lower tier, 70 or more. And now I tell everyone pretty much, across the board, 30. And there's a few programs that do not participate in signaling, and that's, you can apply to those, but I do not think you should apply to more than 30. We had our data from this year actually is 531 apps, and we had 360 signals. So now we will pretty much, our faculty will be reviewing all of those signaled folks. There may be some extenuating circumstances, but the people who will get interviewed, probably near 100% will be those who signaled. Specifically, that's what it was last year. So, Dr. Lansdowne, I obviously pulled a very grainy photo of you from off the website, but I was trying to mess with the last night for whatever reason. But all that to say, what's your recommendation about the number of places that students should apply to?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the signaling program now, I think it should be closer to the 30. I know for us also, if you haven't signaled, like you are just going to be, have a higher chance of just being filtered out. Yeah. So I think you are, wasting effort, wasting money, like you said, if you're just applying to every program, and then it'll be those 30 that really review your application.
No, I think that's a great point, and that was in one of our papers that came out recently. It's over 98% of match applicants had signaled, and when they looked at the programs themselves with a pretty high response rate, that too, in their survey, the 80% only interviewed, or near 80% only interviewed those who signaled specifically. So I think it speaks to how this is being used as a screen in some ways, in combination with other facets of the application. But here, this is a paper that just came out, and to get an interview, the away rotation is still priority, signals, geographic connections. But what was most predictive of their match when they looked at it were the number of interview offers, right? So how much you end up ranking effectively, and your step 2 score. They mentioned step 1 also, but I removed that because that's not as applicable anymore. So on that note, Dr. Schroeder, myself, and Dr. Levine were having an email conversation about this. So I wanted to, of course, put Dr. Schroeder again on the spot about, should students signal their home program over?
Okay, so I'll answer this in 2 ways because this was a very heated debate. If anyone was reading emails through the AOA Accord, and the official answer is, yeah, you are supposed to, right? The idea behind the signaling is it should be fair and equitable for everybody. So if you don't have your own home program, right, and you're doing only away rotations, then you really only get 30 signals. If you have a home program and your home program says, you don't need one for me, but go ahead to that, therefore that makes you have 31. If you rotate at away programs that say you don't need to signal us, you're showing your interest by being here, that gives you 32 or 33. Some schools, such as UCSF, only allow you to rotate at certain programs. So, if we're trying to be as equitable as possible, everybody should signal everywhere, including their own program. Now, when you read these emails, not everybody is doing that. And then as the lead career advisor for our department, you feel incredibly guilty when you tell your own students, no, you have to signal us and you have to signal everyone. So it would be great if there was a steadfast rule, which there isn't.
Yeah, and I think that the debate she's talking about is sort of like, are you on the equation or outside of the equation that you should signal a home place or a place you've done a rotation at, versus should you or should you not, to optimize some of those chances, right? And interestingly, like at our home where I practice at, they're not often encouraged to do that, to give them that extra one. But it's been very clear from the AOA that that's what you should be doing. And I think that, as I've thought about it too, I think one of the challenges is, and I had this whole long drafted response that I was going to send, and then I sent a couple of people to check out before I sent it, so I wouldn't, kind of like get incinerated too much. But I think the tough part is how programs use the signal is also part of the challenge. Not everyone uses it in the same way. And so if you are asking learners to use it in X way, there has to be, kind of an equity of it has to be equitable how programs are using it on the other side too. And I think that is in part where a little bit the discrepancy lies in terms of how they interpret the signal use, or the nuance of it. But yeah, it's a difficult conversation, or discussion, as it were. But when we think about sort of like, hey, signal is one part of it, step 2 is one part of it, away rotations are one part of it. So these, you're not just thinking about this during your 4th year, you're thinking about this way earlier, right? Interest groups are a huge part of that. And they do really help to, for many, in many institutions, allow for connections with faculty and residents and spur on the mentorship element or help to catalyze that. And as we talked about earlier, with interest groups, the match rates are, slightly higher as a result. But, again, this is just because you're in an interest group or you're not, doesn't mean you won't match. It's just to say that, hey, these are different tools that are out there, different pipeline programs and different sort of, places you can look to for resource at the end. I think that, the concept of, advocacy, maintain momentum, reaching out, mock interviews, right? That's, I think, a big part of it as well. That's important. And, we also have to just remember that, the communication element has now come back around in part because we're not seeing everybody, right? You can't rotate at every single program. So in some letters, you read them, and like, okay, certain people are going to write certain letters in a very specific, like, amazing way. They are amazing. Everyone they've worked with is amazing because they know the lingo to include. But that's not always the case, right? So if I call said person, what are they actually like? Oh, well, they're okay. I'm like, but you just made them seem like they were like the greatest thing since sliced bread in your letter of rec, right? And so that is where it becomes, so what else sort of adds to kind of color the application a bit further, and furthermore to like what may give weight to the signal if that person is particularly, capable, as it were. This is, these are just like other important elements to think about with regards to, how students use online resources and where they get their sort of data from. But the mentorship element is still sort of the most important thing. And, as mentors, we're role models, right? So so I can't just say, I can't be like, I don't have time for you, right? If a student reaches out, and I would never say in actuality, oh, you suck, right? I would never actually say that. ChatGPT might, but that's a different story. But really, you have to be available. You got to put your money where your mouth is if this is sort of the path that you're going to go down. And there is obviously the benefit to the mentees. There's the benefit to the mentors, as we talked about earlier. These are just important, considerations as a whole. The letter of recs, as we were in part talking about, they are particularly important, along with step 2, CK scores. And what's the success? Is it the grades? If we don't have grades anymore, is it like, okay, great letters of rec? Is it research? Are these important things that correlate with success? But what it comes down to is that's still evolving as the process is evolving. And so what was a successful match before is not what it is now. And it may not be that in the next few years as things change, curriculums change. But really the bottom line is that, mentorship is critical. The Orthopaedic match is an intimate part of that. And it can be very difficult to navigate. But bottom line is that, we need to be present for this next generation, especially for our patients in the future. So thank you.